Hello everyone, this lecture is on cultural flows and globalization. It's part of your paper on media, culture and society. In this lecture, we will discuss how globalization and media is shaping the cultural processes. We'll also be addressing the relationship of globalization, media and culture through the work of American anthropologist William Margarella. The central concept that Margarella uses to describe the relationship is mediation. He builds up his argument on the critique of two major schools of thought that define the relationship between culture, media and globalization. First, the cultural imperialism thesis that focuses more on institutional apparatus and political economies. Secondly, the cultural substantialism, that thesis that emphasizes revolution and the local. So, to explain Margarella of culture, globalization, mediation, we first discussed the two theoretical models, and then we will continue the theory of media and mediation. This lecture will take you beyond theoretical model of effect of media and culture. You will be introduced to the theory of mediation that challenges the idea that it is through media that culture is mediated. It argues that mediation is a process which precedes the advent of advanced means of communication. But to begin with, we will briefly discuss what is globalization. Before we discuss the relationship between cultural flows and globalization, you need to understand, of course, what is globalization. Globalization means the restructuring of economies in order to cope up with the economic crisis of capitalism. You will be able to understand this meaning if we discuss it with reference to the restructuring of the Indian economy. One of the prominent aspects of globalization is the expansion of market and tightening the control of the economies of the third world countries. In the name of globalization, what is generally defined as the process of becoming a village. The public sector industries, banks, small-scale industries, natural resources were all grabbed by the companies. The process of globalization in India began in 1980s when for the first time Indian economy was opened for foreign investment. Many would argue that the process of globalization is not new for India, as India has been doing global business earlier. Although it is true that India has been into trade relations with other civilizations of the world, but when we use the word globalization, it doesn't mean only global trade. It is more than that. The Indian economy was caught in a debt trap in 1980s, and to come out this crisis, the government turned to International Monetary Fund for loan. It is common sense wisdom that if a bank lends you money, there are conditions attached to that loan. So was the case of International Monetary Fund. When they gave loan to India, the conditions was initiating the structural changes in the Indian economy, obviously. Going by this, the Indian economy relaxed the restrictions on trade policies and license. This is also called liberalization, meaning by liberalizing the trade-related laws. You know the plight of Indian farmers and small-scale industries during the time of British colonial rule, who introduced trade laws that favored the commodities imported from Britain, thereby marginalizing the Indian farmers and traders. So British colonial exploited the raw material from India available to them on a negligible cost and then converting it into finished product to be sold in colonial markets without any tax restrictions. Now in 1980s, with the trade relaxation, an extended form of these processes was introduced, again putting the Indian farmers, workers and small-scale traders and people at India at risk. Companies like Suzuki, Xerox and many others entered India. Then in the year 1991, the government of India took another loan from the IMF, which led to introductions of economic reforms at a very large scale. When the second wave of liberalization, the very aspect of Indian economy was leased out to foreign investors. You should not think that India was the only country undergoing such changes. Many Asian and African countries were witnessing these changes too. Globalization and cultural invasion from skies in India, the post-1991 period witnessed the mushrooming of a private transaction satellite channels, including regional language channels, due to the deregulation of the Indian economy of 1991. The Indian households got introduced to the transnational satellite channels with the coverage of Gulf War in 1991, CNN that was made available, such as major hotels. This was followed by the Star TV, that is satellite television for the Asian region, Star, in August 1991, which began its transmission with 4 channels beaming from Hong Kong: the Star Plus, the MTV, the Music Television, BBC World Service, British Broadcasting Corporation, and Prime Sports. After this, GTB was launched in October 1992. The expansion of the television industry in post-1991, that was in conjunction with the wider changes in economic spheres of the country, resulted in an exponential increase in access to transnational images. This was exemplified in the telecasting of the Western content, including the so-called soap operas. The direct beaming of Western content created rhetoric of cultural invasion from the skies, and the anxieties became pronounced when Indian cultural values were placed in opposition to an undifferentiated West. In this context, Purnima Markenkar argues that the spectral presence of the West shaped the conflicts and debates that arose in the definition of Indianness and the boundaries between the East and the West. The rapid expansion of transnational satellite television was responded to with a mixture of excitement and anxiety, and considered a threat to the purity of national cultural and national sovereignty. There was much concern that the telecast of imported programs and channels such as MTV would contaminate the Indian culture. In response to this cultural invasion, there started a process of so-called Indianization of programs on transnational satellite channels. As a consequence of the process of localization, some of the channels like Star Plus and Sunny broadcasted dubbed English serials. There appeared a revisiting of some of the foreign formats, such as the highly successful Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, into Kaun Banega Crorepati, which was a huge success on television like Star Plus, especially when a star like Amitabh Bachchan was appointed to host it. We know that Robert Clive, the British officer, conquered India through the British military supremacy and established British colonial rule that lasted for almost 2 centuries. But this new form of colonization, entertaining through the process of globalization, was unlike British colonialism, based on the power of technologically advanced means of communication developed for the first time in the United States and then imperialist part of the world. Now, the colonials do not require a repressive apparatus, that is the sword to conquer, as they have the new means of ideological domination. And it is here that the discussion on culture enters in with regard to the process of globalization. Let us now discuss how culture flows through the technologically advanced means of communication prompted by the process of globalization generated the debate. Now let us talk about cultural flows and globalization. Scholars argue that the world after globalization see culture everywhere, when they mean this is the new technologies of mass media are occupied with cultural representation of various kinds. Culture was directly flowing into our bedrooms through television. Stuart Hall, in his essay, The Centrality of Culture, Notes on the Cultural Revolutions of Our Time, says that will emerge and the expansion of new media technologies, cultural activities and institutions have expanded and assumed an unparalleled significance of the structure of organization of modern societies. The means of producing, circulating and exchanging culture has been dramatically expanded. Cultural industries have become the dominant mediating element in every other process. Along with this, the markets were also floated and global commodities as an unprecedented level. So profit was being realized not only through the sale of tangible communities, but also through intangible commodities. The encounter of global and local cultures prompted by the process of globalization created what is called cultural panics and confrontations. Scholars have also referred to this as the process of cultural globalization, cultural hegemony of cultural imperialism. Cultural imperialism has been one of the ways in which globalization and cultural flows were theorized. Stuart Hall argues that despite this process of homogenization, there exist contravening tendencies preventing the world from becoming a culturally uniform and homogeneous space. This argument is furthered by the evidences that show that global culture thrives on differences, and even if ultimate effect is the conversion of the difference into another cultural commodity for the world market, such as ethnic cuisine, it is therefore more likely to produce simultaneously new global and new local identifications than some uniform and homogeneous world culture. These arguments are further extended by Mazzarella in his theory of mediation. One of the contributions of cultural homogeneity theory is that it doesn't separate the means of communication from the mode of production in society. Hence, it analyzes the technological advanced means of communication as technical infrastructure that is essential for the European imperialism for its expansion. The communicational apparatus of capitalism is the articulation of social relations between people. The calculation of capital and information is an inherent aspect of this apparatus. Communication is inextricably linked with the process of production and exchange of commodities, we know, and cultural homogenization and cultural heterogenization. And let's talk about this. There are scholars who have highlighted the twofold process of relations between globalization and cultural flow. These twofold processes are particularization of the universal and the universalization of the particular. Appadurai remarks that the tension between this twofold process of cultural homogenization and cultural heterogenization is central to global cultural interactions. American sociologist Judge Reza refers to the process of cultural homogenization as McDonaldization, and the globe by which he means that the principle of the fast food restaurant had been extended to almost all sectors of society. So according to Reza, McDonaldization is not about a fast food restaurant, McDonald's, but it's a process of affecting and transforming the whole world. McDonald's is characterized by the process of relationship and depends on a few parameters, and the same process, if applicable to society as well. It is about cultural standardization of cultural production in every corner of the globe, eroding the homogeneity of cultures. Similarly, the Frankfurt Schools of Contribution is highlighting the aspect of standardization through cultural industry is also significant. The trait of cultural homogenization or Americanization of culture was so high that contestations between United States and European Union, particularly France, emerged. In 1993, the policy of cultural exception was adopted by France to resist the American cultural onslaught. Cultural exception is a term that aims to legitimize the regulatory measures to protect the local creation and production in Europe. The term was applied to films and then to audiovisual works. The term is now understood as a political measure seeking to preserve the public domain and to favor cultural diversity and democratic pluralism. It represents the first real configuration between the idea of globalization and that of Americanization. Those who favored cultural exception, known as exceptionists, argued that each country has the right to safeguard their cultural industries. Exceptionists consider that the global market is dominated by small American conglomerates. The exceptionists do not see cinema and other audiovisual cultural forms as simply a form of entertainment, but as an art and heritage. Cultural exception clearly advocates the idea of cultural diversity to challenge the homogenization of world version by American domination. William Merzela argues that the cultural imperialism model comprehensive on macro level determinants of social change. As a critic of cultural imperialism, this other theoretical strand that emerges takes the everyday life as a vantage point, which assigns the more dynamic role to the aspect of perception. Mazzarella says that if the cultural imperialism thesis has underplayed the significance of reception, the active audience model has completely missed out of discussion on structure and relationship power. In fact, it diverted attention away from the complex of institutions, mediations of interest that used to be known as the cultural industry. He argues that we need to go beyond these binaries of power and existence, structure and agency, micro and macro, political economy and culture. As against the cultural homogenization thesis, there are scholars who advocate cultural heterogeneization through revision of local as well as globalization. Merzela argues that the relationship of local theory of primary narratives of how nation remains an important unit of representation. According to him, the revalorization of local relies on the view that media are something that happen to or are imposed on already constituted local worlds. The local in this view is composed of a certain set of cultural values and practices to which media must then adapt in order to find an audience. The media are then commonly understood to impact the local world in a number of beneficial and deleterious ways. This formulation never addressed the fact that mediation and its attendant cultural politics necessarily precedes the arrival of what commonly recognized as media, that in fact local worlds are necessarily already the outcome of more or less stable, more or less local social technologies of mediation. The focus on the production of local promulgates that the global events are selectively domesticated in tandem with core social values of the domestic system of common sense knowledge. Some scholars have highlighted the phenomenon of hybridity as product of interaction of local cultures, globalization and media. The repetitively cited examples of such cultural hybridity are Tibetan monks with cell phones, Indian villagers with computers in their hands, a Coke bottle as part of the Indian family functions, and many others. The study of local adaptation of globally circulating types of entertainment and information such as soap opera, talk shows, and the news and consumer brands and their advertising are also included under hybridity. In such celebrations of cultural hybridity, we move away from any understanding of the grounded actuality of the cultural politics. We need to take into consideration that the social processes of mediation as the site of cultural politics. So according to Mazzarella, this revalorization of local thesis, which emphasizes on the notion of active audience, resisting cultural imperialism and producing local cultural forms while interacting with the global cultural forms, doesn't consider media and culture as co-constitutive. For him, the discourse of globalization relies on an exaggerated sense of novelty, which gives an impression that satellite television and internet and other mass media forms have suddenly made people dependent on an external process of mediation, whereas previously stable and locally rooted schema have sufficed the sense of the world. This way of theorization of substantialist models of culture and cultural correspondence diverts away our attention from the real question of culture as ideology. Culture as ideology is a social process that is continuously made and remade through constantly shifting relations, practices, and technologies of mediation. Now about media and mediation. With this critique, he brings in the concept of mediation. He says that prior to the arrival of modern means of communication, culture was mediated through various other means. This way, local culture has always been embedded in the processes of mediation. In fact, culture itself is an outcome of the social process of mediation. He says that today we might witness a phenomenon where a traditional rural ritual is being performed specially for television camera. But we should not forget that the same ritual has served as a significant medium with its own distinctive mechanisms, providing local culture as identity. So the problem is less about the meeting of culture and media, but more about the intersection of the two or more systems of mediation. With the invention of modern means of communication and the economic process of globalization, the mediation has taken up new forms. Therefore, one needs to ask questions like what the mediations through which cultural practices are constituted before and after the intervention of arrival. Mediation for him is a process which existed even before the invention of media in any society. Mediation is a process through which local cultures become aware of themselves, and that's why Mazzarella argues that despite the dominance of cultural imperialism, local cultures are witnessing cultural assertions of group identity and national identity, which is true. Mediation and globalization are inevitably changing and strengthening methods of cultural expression. The conception of mediation will safeguard us from committing the mistake of contrasting local culture with a media-saturated world. So friends, we have come to the conclusion of this presentation. Therefore, in this lecture, you have learned about the relationship between culture, media, and globalization through the work of American anthropologist William Mazzarella. His theory of media and mediation provides the critique of earlier theoretical models of this relationship. His theory of media and mediation brings back the question of culture and ideology rooted in old social processes and mediation. Globalization and media has heightened the process of mediation, but mediated culture is now a new phenomenon. Through this theory, he confronted the attempts of looking at local cultures and media as two worlds apart. Hope you enjoyed this lecture. For more details, please read the modules carefully and attempt the questions given at the end of the module. Thank you.